Thank you for coming back. I was kind of surprised to see you all back, so I'm very grateful. And I hope the watch party didn't turn us off for a football game or something. So I'm so grateful for the watch party mechanism. Those of you who put that together, thank you. It's a way for us to be in this together. So this morning, I was invited to speak about grace and hope. And when you speak about grace and hope, it lends itself to talking about how we live it out together. So I'll start with some stories about grace, because this is how grace is lived out in us and in stories. And I'll move through the ways in which we are the church today, because I covet that this time would be useful to you. So there'll be some theological grounding, but then there'll be some conversation about where the church is today and where it may be going and how we may help each other be United Methodists and be faithful with all the abundance that God has given us. So I'll start with a story. Jürgen Moltmann was 17 years old during World War II, growing up in Germany. And they'd run through all the people that they could draft. And then they started conscripting kids. And he was conscripted into the German army. And he saw things in war that a kid shouldn't see, that no human should see. And he was captured and taken to a prisoner of war camp in Scotland, for which he thanks God. Because at the prisoner of war camp in Scotland, the guard gave him a copy of the scriptures. And he had not grown up with it, and even at 17, he had not had much grounding in scripture from his family experience. So to read a Bible was a new introduction to him for the life of faith. And the second introduction to him was that there was a British clergy person serving near the camp who checked out a handful of prisoners of war for the Sunday lunch he and his spouse served at their own family table. So Moltmann talks about how on a rotating basis, a pastor had them to a Sunday table for lunch. And it was there that he came to know Jesus, at the table. At the table. And it was there that he began to make sense of his experience. Out of that sense, he became a theologian. And I read Moltmann all the time. He passed away about a year or two ago. But one of his sentences stays with me. Moltmann famously said, "Only a suffering God can help." Only a suffering God can help. When people suffer, the question is raised by the suffering: is God deaf? Is God without compassion? Is God real? Does God care? Or if God works through God's people, where are they? Do God's people really respond to the Holy Spirit? Do they really have the love of God at the core of their discipleship? So suffering with others is central to the ministry of Jesus. Think about all the people in Jesus' stories, that offering oneself to the pain of the other in order that the other has a chance at a transcendence or new life or a new beginning is central to life with Jesus. And if we do not embrace suffering, we will be superficial in our ministry. If we do not embrace suffering with God, we cannot speak to the world with credibility. And to blame people for their suffering is not the answer of Job or Jesus. And I'm here to say, grace is the love that comes from a suffering God. Because God has suffered with us. God knows we do not need to have our noses rubbed in yesterday. Because God has suffered with us in Jesus Christ. God knows human pain. Because we have a suffering God, God knows that it is more important to offer newness of life than to go back and inventory yesterday endlessly. Grace is the unearned, upbuilding love that God offers all people, made new in the world. Grace is unconditional. It is offered to all of us. And ministry, I believe ministry is living by grace in our daily lives. And because grace is for anyone, if grace is for anyone, ministry can be from anyone to anyone, right? You don't need to have some fancy piece of paper to operate your life by grace, right? Grace is the capacity of God's love to transform and make new, and it comes out of our baptism. So because ministry is living by grace in our daily lives, ministry can be from anyone to anyone. So grace sets us free in God's newness and sets us free to serve. We do not need permission to serve because grace calls us forward to live grace. Now I want to talk a little bit about the time that we find ourselves in, because I've been in ministry in the Wisconsin Annual Conference since Fred Flintstone. How many of you went to high school with Fred Flintstone? I mean, you know, the little cars and the little, yeah. Oh man, those were great. So it used to be that time was synchronous. Fancy name for it was trustworthy. Time, one day would look very much like another, And people who led their churches or their organizations, they could do a vision process because 1 year would look like the next year would look like the next year. And you remember 5-year plans and 3-year plans. And you could trust that if your church wanted to get to a place, well, we'd plan, we'd begin with the end in mind, and we'd plan and we'd get there. So in the last 6 months, I've been talking with a United Methodist think tank called Wesley Impact Partners. People by the name of Gil Rendell work for them, and Susan Beaumont, and people who go out and they not only do the research, but they practice it by equipping congregations. And they're telling bishops now that you no longer have the capacity to think, well, this year will be just like next year, be like next year. So because time is fractured, and we're living in a fractured time, if we do a 3-year plan based on what we see today, we don't know what next week looks like. We don't know what next month looks like. We don't know what 2 years from now looks like. So if we marched off into a 3-year plan, we could go off into a distraction or the wrong thing or misspend our resources on what else may emerge for us that we have to pay attention to. So Wesleyan Impact Partners, and I would offer this to you as you lead. You know, when I was a superintendent, I learned that there's 10 people in every church that make it go, right? Now, the church could be a 500 attendance church, and it could be a 10 attendance church. And there's 10 people in every church that make it go, right? And I trust that some of those 10 are here today. And for your leadership, I would just say that this is such a fractured time. Wesleyan Impact Partners is telling us that we need to name the time and then the vision that is needed for this time, because it may be different in a month or 2 or 3. Now, the danger in that is that we'll just leapfrog across our days and never get anywhere. But I trust that if the Spirit shows us what the time is, that we'll be called into the right things for the right time. And that's why I wanted to think about the grace that is needed for this time. In such a fractured time, in a time when people are divided, so divided. For us to be the community of faith, we have to be a people of grace, enough that we can demonstrate love across our differences. So for this fractured time, I've called us into a year of grace. Not a year to simply defend someone who is abusing us or harming us or not repentant of things that do harm. It's not that kind of grace. That's codependency. I'm not talking about that kind of grace. I'm talking about where we're different from each other, where we think differently or practice differently. I'm asking us as best we can for this fractured time to live in grace with each other, and grace for the experiments that I will talk about in a few moments. The capacity to look ahead being what it is, I would encourage us for this fractured time to do the best you can to love your neighbor. This has always been a love your neighbor religion. There's never been a day when it wasn't a love your neighbor religion. And I will ask you as your spiritual leader to expand your view of who your neighbor is. Your neighbor is the person God has given you to love in whatever way or shape or form that is. And so we'll be called every day to love our neighbors in many ways. They're physical neighbors, but they're the neighbors who serve us at the restaurant, or they're the neighbors who work alongside us in the Faith Alive ministry. They're the neighbors in the conference office. We have neighbors everywhere. I'll invite us to think about grace being extended to a wider range of neighbors than many people think. So I will think about making that more clear in a moment. But the proverb that I shared with you is the heart of Ubuntu, that a person is a person through other persons, means Ubuntu. It's an African concept that means my well-being is your well-being, and your well-being is my well-being. And if you're not well, that creates a cycle. And we've made a joke out of the turn your cheek passage of Jesus, but the Beatitudes, that turn your cheek passage, was so that cycles of violence would stop. Jesus counseled those who would follow Jesus, rather than increase the violence and strike out in violence, to turn, rather than do harm, turn your own cheek for violence, so that we create cycles of well-being and not cycles of violence. Ubuntu is to live with neighbor in such a way that we create cycles of blessing and mutual benefit and not cycles of violence. So I want to talk about grace to kick us off. And I'll tell you in a few moments of the very first day I learned grace. So some of you have heard this, so you can take a mental nap for about 60 seconds, but then come back again after that, okay? So when I was 9, my folks divorced. And my mom, because her side was Methodist, she didn't feel like she could go back to the Methodist church because divorce at that time was a big deal. And so she went to a big non-denominational church on the edge of town. And she tried. She tried raising her boys there and tried going there. And then she met this wonderful man who became my stepfather. Probably one of the most gentle Christians I've ever met in my life. And because they were serious about this and wanted their marriage to work, they went to this non-denominational pastor and said, well, now, we know that getting married in a church often means that we have to sit down with the pastor and learn some things. We open our lives to this. We want to be married in this church. And the pastor, who was in a non-denominational church, who did not have a theological education that United Methodists require, said, Well, now there's a passage in Mark that says if you get remarried again, that both of you will go to hell. She hasn't been the same since. And we lived at the edge of the Christian ecosystem for a while. I couldn't believe that God would just treat people that way. But we were told by a religious authority that we would be going to hell if that happened. And my stepdad was baptized by J. Ellsworth Callis in the Concord United Methodist Church. And he said, well, now, don't give up. I'm a Methodist, and Methodists will take anyone. Right? Right? Methodists will take anyone. So now with the lens of where I am today, I might say that more clearly, like, we believe God's love is extended for all persons in all circumstances in all time. And not just we'll take anybody, but we will take anybody. Right? So he went down the road and talked to the Methodist pastor there, and a man named Rick Brewer drove 40 minutes because my soon-to-be stepfather told Rick Brewer, well, this will all be great, but one of her boys is very angry with God. And would you go talk to him? He drove 40 minutes. And had set up an appointment, and I was back against the wall in my bedroom. And he sat down, the door was closed, and he said, do you know that God loves you? And I brought up this passage from Mark. Well, if God loves me, why? And he said, stop with that. And he explained to me the background of that passage. He said, in that day and time, it was so easy for a man to divorce a woman. And it was impossible for a woman to sustain herself. There were no jobs. You couldn't own land. You couldn't go out and start a business. You couldn't get an education. So in that day and time, in the first century, a man could say, I divorced thee 3 times, and be divorced from his wife for having dinner on the table late. And he said to me, Jesus said that because he was troubled with religion that threw people away like paper cups. Jesus was troubled with religion that threw people away like paper cups. It may be that it is in this moment I need to just be super clear that racism is incompatible with Christian teaching. Jesus was troubled with religion that threw people away like paper cups. I can still see him. I can still hear it when he said, grace is the love that God offers us so that we're always offered newness of life. That God is always making new in our lives. So while that happened, God is in this working with you. And God has purpose for your life. So listen to grace. I can still see my bedroom. I can still see his face. And I'm here to tell you, grace changed my life. It allowed me back into a sanctuary. It allowed me to sing the hymns and the songs, these things that sustain us. It allowed me to be in a pew that day when Reverend Leisman talked about the body of Christ and that how we live together had the capacity to make Christ known in the world. And I wanted my life to be part of that. I wanted to be part of that. But I wouldn't have gotten there without grace. Grace is not just love, but it's upbuilding love. It's love that builds us up. It's not just love that excuses or says, well, you can keep doing what you're doing. It's upbuilding love. Paul, throughout the New Testament, uses the word edification. It's not a fancy word, but it is to build up. An edifice is a building. And he uses this image that we're a building from God. So my encouragement to you is to remember that Jesus was troubled with religion that threw people away like paper cups. And I want you to think about grace in your life. I'm going to give you like 45 seconds, so don't dawdle. And then I'm going to see if there are 2 or 3 people sitting around you who look like they'd talk to you. And then tell them where you've seen grace. Now, it doesn't have to be a life. If it's a super personal thing, don't, it's not share or die. But if you had like grace at the McDonald's today or grace at your church, I hope in the year of grace that we can begin to learn more how to tell stories of grace. So I'm going to give you 45 seconds. And when that's over, I'm going to ask you to turn to those 2 or 3 people and just share where you've seen grace. The clock has started. Be thinking about grace. In about 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you to come back and give your attention to the whole. But why don't you turn now and see if there's a way we could build faith community by sharing grace stories with each other. Okay, friends, let's come back. I'm so grateful to see and hear some of the conversations. I was part of a life-giving conversation, and I can see that you've engaged with each other. So thank you for that. And I want to take this just a little step further, if you don't mind. So Ubuntu, this idea that our well-being, my well-being is your well-being, and your well-being is my well-being, and that a person is a person through other persons, is lived out in 1,000 ways every day. My daughter's a social worker. It's the social worker who works a little longer because that one needs it. It's the teacher who works a little harder because that one needs it. It's the person at the hotel I was at who said, now, this is how you get out, and don't worry, and you use the card, and there's a drop box for it. Now hold your hand if you have to, right? There are 1,000 kindnesses. It's you staying in your lane on a 2-lane highway. It's keeping to the promise that I'm not just here for myself, but that a person is a person through other persons. There are 1,000 ways we live that out every day, especially in a love your neighbor religion. So there are 1,000 ways we live that out, and I wanted to touch on one of the elements of how we live Ubuntu steps with each other. And I'm going to watch. I hope your eyes don't glaze over. But what I'd like to do is talk a little bit more deeply about how the United Methodist Church organizes itself around one principle. It's kind of an Ubuntu principle. We share for the good of the whole mission. We share for the good of the whole mission. And let me explain in the ways that Wesley conceived it. Wesley read Luke 10, that Jesus sent people to every town and place where he himself intended to go. Wesley saw this as a sent mission, that people are sent out into a lot of towns and communities, but that we share for the good of the whole. That is, we share our, I'm going to use a dirty word here, apportionments, our appointments, and our assets. Let me explain. So if your principle for the mission is to share for the good of the whole mission, you just think about that. And the appointments are structured that way. Every appointment is made based on needs and gifts. The assignment of bishops is made on needs and gifts. It wasn't just because I love Wisconsin. When I was sent to Wisconsin, they said, the people in that committee said, we have these needs and we think this guy's got the gifts. So appointments are made on needs and gifts. And let me tell you a story about that. So back in the Jurassic Age, I was the district superintendent in Milwaukee. And I had a pastor who had been in an embezzlement before, did healing in his ministry, then was currently in an embezzlement. It's like once they have these needs and gifts, we were deploying that person to those places. He had special experience. Well, then we had an embezzlement in another part of the state. So most moves happen because the pastor or the church requested. But in that case, the bishop said, if this place is going to be healed, the very best person we have has 2 experiences of how to heal an embezzlement. Dan, I want you to go to this church and ask the SBRC to share their pastor with this place up the road that needs somebody. So I went, called the SBRC together. They were in year 6. They were having great ministry. And I said, well, we have this thing up the road. This place suffered an embezzlement. And they started to cry. They knew why I was there. But by the time we were done, they were like, we send you because you are the best pastor for that very place. And we have people in this room who are doing healing work. Healing work because they've done healing work in other places. We figure out they can do healing work and we send them to the next healing that they got to do. And we make this covenant that we share for the good of the whole. So that means we listen to needs and we put gifts together. But then when somebody's got that gift and there's that need down the road, we ask you to share for the good of the whole. It's not perfect. Bishops make mistakes. Superintendents learn their churches and pastors the best they can. These superintendents work mighty hard. They work mighty, mighty hard. They're mighty hard. They really, conference staff, they work. We have a wonderful team. But it only works if we share for the good of the whole. Now, the next thing is the apportionment. We share for the good of the whole. It's on a ability to pay basis. You know what the ability to pay is derived from is those statistical reports that are filled out every year. I know they're like a root canal, but you fill those out, and we assess apportionments based on our ability to support the mission together. And people will say, well, what has the conference ever done for us? And I say, we sent you the pastor, and they may not be happy with that one. But then they say, what else have you done? And I say, we credentialed that pastor. We have camps. We have discipleship resources. And now when there's the ways that we need to stand with immigrants, we put resources together. Our director of connectional ministry is working night and day to help some of the most vulnerable people and equip people to help vulnerable people. We have people with us who help us find property insurance. I mean, that is not glitzy. I mean, but it's hard in this environment to find property insurance for churches. I want to tell you, I have 2 annual conference experiences that will tell you it is extraordinarily difficult. But we have people who do that so that you're not getting taken advantage of by somebody who's out to maybe make a buck off of you. With the apportionment, we share for the good of the whole. It's not perfect. But that's a pretty decent principle around which to hang your polity. The third way we share for the good of the whole, and this is the most tender one, so I'm glad I have a little bit of wood in front of me. It's called the trust clause. Now think of this. This is back when John Wesley was envisioning a movement of Methodists. He met together with the legal minds of his day, and he thought, how do we keep the assets of a preaching house? Say the preaching house down the road is called Yellow River Falls, okay? So say Yellow River Falls develops a preach. I just made it up, you can tell. So Yellow River Falls has a preaching house. In Wesley's day, they weren't called churches, they were called preaching houses, okay? So Yellow River Falls has a preaching house. And the movement, the mission invests in Yellow River Falls because people are moving to Yellow River Falls and it needs a ministry. So we start a ministry in Yellow River Falls, right? In order for that ministry then to be assured that Methodist doctrine, Methodist theology will be preached and proclaimed and lived, Wesley owned the preaching house. Which means he set it up so that the conference owns the preaching house. And that means that we depend on the people in Yellow River Falls to keep the building nice and pretty and maintain the assets that we have. Because 100 years later or 200 years later, the ministry will change because people groups move. And if the ministry dries up in Yellow River Falls, why lose the assets in Yellow River Falls when we can use those assets in Orange River Falls when we start a new ministry down there? No, this is why the trust clause exists, so that Methodist theology can be proclaimed and so that we keep the assets with the mission. Why would we give up those assets? Because a good stewardship of those assets pays attention to where we share for the good of the whole mission. The third reason now you'll be at a cocktail party and somebody's going to ask you, what are the three covenants of United Methodist polity? And you're going to be able to say, well, everybody knows it's the appointment and the apportionment and the trust clause. And within that, there are three reasons for the trust clause. For the assurance that Methodist theology is proclaimed and so that the assets stay with the mission. And then the third reason for the trust clause, I mean, it's fancy at a cocktail party. The third reason for the trust clause is this. Wesley believed in a free pulpit. And if local people called the clergy and local people owned the preaching house, they might be tempted, not you, but they might be tempted to dull the prophetic spirit of the preacher. Right? They own the place, and they could tell you, you've done enough damage, it's time for you to move on. Right? Wesley was so serious about keeping a free pulpit that he established quarterly conferences to check on all these preaching houses. And there was a rubric of questions. And you know what one of the questions was? He asked in front of all the gathered, has the preacher shown sufficient zeal so as to offend at least one person from your movement? Right? Right? And if the preacher did not offend at least one, the preacher was moved. Right? I've been really good about that one. But okay, so you see, friends, we have to live together. We belong to each other in our baptism. But our polity is built around the freedom of a pulpit so that we can be a prophetic people. Now, there is a balance in that. Pastors know, I mean, one of the things in Ministry 101 is that the pastoral office is one of shepherd, pastor. We shepherd people. We attend to the sick and the dying and the ways in which we live out the pastoral role as pastor, as shepherd. Then there's priest. Look at, we enjoyed the sacraments today in a way that hopefully offers us the means of grace. There's a shepherding, pastoring, there's priest, and then there's prophet. And they're interdependent. And you can't, I mean, there are some days and some moments in your history when you're kind of 2 out of 3 prophetic, but you can't give up the shepherding piece, or the people will not be able to hear you. You have to live out of your pastoring and shepherding and also your priestly. It's an interdependence and it's an art, and it's difficult work. It's more difficult. now than it's ever been. But I share these, we share for the good of the whole. And it may be that it's imperfect because there's so many imperfect people doing the mission. But if there's a better principle around which to organize your church, I'd like to hear it. You know? It's not perfect. But if people ask you, we're designed to share for the good of the whole mission. Now, I've talked long enough. I've offended 45% of you. Would you turn to those other people that you were just talking with and share with them which one of those fact burgers you did not know before? Because I'll tell you, there are many times I sit down with a pastor, and the pastors maybe didn't have this in seminary, right? And don't really have it in the top of their heads. So turn to those people who look like they'll talk to you, and for 4 minutes, share which one of these 3 things that you didn't know about, or the free pulpit or whatever, or talk about the ministry in Yellow Falls. I don't care, but I'm going to give you 4 minutes, okay? I'm going to give you 4 minutes. Okay, let's talk about hope. Let's talk about hope. I do have 2 pieces that I want to get to today that I want to leave you with, because I said this matters so much, this time that we have together, and I hope that it's helpful to you for your leadership. But I want to talk about hope. You know, the thing I get asked more than anything is not about the trust clause, apportionments, but people ask me, particularly because after maybe a member of the delegation dies, or there's a tragedy in Madison and you call the people who responded, I often get the question, where do you find hope? So I'd like to share about that a little bit. I think embedded in the call forward is the hope that if God is the one calling us forward, that God is calling us into hope. God will not call us forward to our harm, but God is the one calling. So if God is calling us and God is the call forward, our call forward, our God, is hope more deeply. Hemingway wrote a book called The Old Man and the Sea. And it's a thin little book, so I could read it. And there's a protagonist by the name of Santiago who goes out fishing. He gets the catch of his life. This great big fish, and it's so big it can't get into the boat. So he lashes it to the side of his boat so that he can take it back to shore. Well, you know what happens. The scent of the blood brings the sharks. And the sharks start on his boat. And they start on the side where this great fish is lashed. And they battle against that boat all night. And he can't go toward the shore because they're interrupting his forward progress. So I have this picture from The Old Man and the Sea where Hemingway paints this portrait of his own demise. So this boat has got the fish of his life, and the sharks are pulling away until the very end. He has used every club, every pole, every harpoon to battle the sharks off until they're embedded in the sharks and gone. He has no defense of himself. And the fish is about gone. And his only hope is that the wave brings him back to shore. And it's at that point in the narrative he writes, "It is a sin not to hope. It is a sin not to hope." You remember the story about the road to Emmaus? And the gospel writer Luke shares this story about the people who travel 7 miles to Emmaus, and they're talking with each other about the loss and the grief of the past days. And there's this person who doesn't seem to know what's taken place in the last day. Do you not know the things that have taken place among us in the last days in Jerusalem? Jesus, the one who we believed was the Messiah, was crucified. And you heard them sharing. And then they said to this person who was alongside them, we had hoped he would be the one to redeem Israel. So you know how the story goes. They continue that 7-mile trek, and Jesus is alongside them, but it's not visible to them. Let's take that apart. For me, when people ask me, where do you find hope? I pull out the Emmaus story. And I talk about all the times in my life that Jesus has been alongside of me, but I had no idea. And over the course of that journey, Jesus shares the scriptures. And did not our hearts burn? I mean, there were elements of signs. There were little these signs. Did our hearts not burn within us as he spoke to us along the road? So when the resurrected Lord is with you, there is this burning heart, this transformative experience, this life that knows Christ. And hope, I believe, is the comfort. It's Methodist, so there'll be 3 things. The comfort that Jesus comes alongside with the right scripture, with the right signs, with the right presence to walk with them. Where do I find hope on the road to Emmaus? It's the comfort that comes walking alongside the risen Lord. Second thing, the risen Christ is with them. The one who defeated death is with them. The one who defeated empire is with them. The one who took the worst thing that the empire could give them and continues to live on. The one who not only defeated empire, but rather than create more cycles of violence, did not suggest the world would be redeemed by violence, but that the world would be redeemed by a nonviolent sacrifice, rather than to suggest that the world would be redeemed by violence. So the risen Lord came with comfort, but the risen Lord also came with the power that overcomes death and empire. Third, the risen Lord came with grace. You know how the story ends. They broke bread. They were transformed. What is grace but the transformation of the believer? What is grace but the transformation of the believer? Where do I find hope? I am sitting in a room full of them. I find hope because of your witness. The transformed believer, the newness that God would bring in the transformed believer is grace. And the grace was so powerful. What did they do? They got up from the table and they said, we have to go live this thing and proclaim this thing. I can't wait to tell Peter and, all of the next chapters. But it was so compelling that their life was seized by grace. Think on that a minute. Their life was so seized by newness, they went back to proclaim it. My life is seized by the mission. I've just seen it. This is my 40th year of ministry. Don't do any math. I've learned never to underestimate our God. My life has been seized by grace. I told you the story of when it started for me. Where do I find hope? There are people in these pews and the pews that you're going to go home to, and their lives are seized by grace. The comfort of Christ is alongside them. The power to defeat empire and death is beside them. But grace is among us. Those are the ways in which I find hope. I'm going to take 10 more minutes of your time, but first I'm going to ask you to turn for 2 minutes next to each other. And where do you find hope? And if you don't have it today, it's okay, because somebody else does. So turn to somebody who looks hopeful to you, right? Where do you find hope? Where do you find hope? I wonder if I can call you back. You know, I heard a little laughter in the room, like a little unauthorized happiness breaking out, right? Yeah, well, hope, grace, the fruits of the Spirit allow us to laugh at our circumstances. So it was good to hear a little bit of laughter, a little levity among you while you share it with each other. I want to respect that the people following me are supposed to be on 11:30, but I gave you a little bit of break, so I got one more little gizmo I'm going to give you. So I don't get to be with you very much, and I don't ever know when I'll get the chance again. So I want to share just a little bit more. So the verse that I've been thinking about from that first chapter of Jeremiah are the verbs I told you about in verse 10. This very day, I appoint you over nations and empires to dig up, right? You get the picture from the garden, to dig up and to pull down, to destroy and to demolish, and to build and to plant. Basic to the prophetic witness is sometimes you have to tear stuff down in order to build it again. That's basic to the prophetic witness. And I wish that I could be your bishop, like when Peter Cartwright, they added 3,000 churches every day, or the Acts of the Apostles, 5,000 were added over lunch, that kind of stuff. I mean, that's just never been my experience. So, but I do want to equip you with some of the things that we're facing, and then some hopeful signs in the midst of that. I shared with you the size of the congregations now and where they are. But there's a book that the Council of Bishops read and the College of Bishops read. It's boring. It has no pictures in it. But it's called Susan Beaumont's How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. And this is work that's been done on statistics and socioeconomic realities and looking at other denominations. But Susan, and I'm going to give you the 7th chapter so you don't have to yawn through 6, and I got to get done by 11:30. So she talks about how the church, if you want to use an image, the church is sort of melting. It's not yet greening. We don't yet see signs of greening everywhere, but the church seems to be melting. And it's wherever you are. I hope you don't feel like it's only your local church, but some churches are growing, and we're starting new congregations, and we have mergers that are taking off in the 2 conferences. We have MCCI, the ways that we walk with congregations. Scott Carlson is here if you want to talk to him about it. That we walk with congregations, give them prescriptions of things that they could work on to make their ministry more vital. We walk with those congregations. But there was a time when I started ministry that you could simply open the doors and guests would come. And if you could retain 33% of your guests, your church grew. But the church is entering what she calls a liminal time. It's a Roman word that means threshold time. It's passing from one experience into another. And that is exemplified. But when I went to Waukesha, they said, now, we're going to show you our confirmation photos from the 1960s. And they were like this wide. And they show me these photos, and they're like County Stadium, Miller Park, American Family Park. It's like, you're kidding me. We were the first church in the annual conference that had 1,000 members, blah, blah. And they're like, we want you to do this. And I'm like, well, then where are those people? Right? Where are those people? I don't know where they are. But the church is melting. And she says that this is a season that we have to let go of what worked then, because it's no longer working now. And more than that, we have to embrace the fact that this is not coming back. I mean, I work really hard, but I can't bring back 1965. And what Beaumont says is that the leaders at the helm of organizations must lead with presence and hopefulness and honesty. And a leader who is invested in knowing things and advocating and striving and having the answers will have difficulty seeing the new thing that God is bringing, because they will be working out of old answers. But the leader who embraces emergence or newness practices what she says is unknowing, attending, surrendering, and yielding. Those are spiritual muscles. Wesley's prayer, I freely and heartily yield all things to thy pleasure and disposal. This is a season, as hard as it is. I mean, I'd made my homiletical bread and butter doing these old things that used to work. But if I do those old things, I will continue to hide where the innovation is possible. What I mean by that is, a leader could just say, well, we're just going to move the money here, and we're going to do this thing here, and then nobody will know. What that nobody will know means people do not ask the questions that lead them to innovation. Right? We don't innovate when it's 75 and sunny. We innovate when we hurt. So for us to embrace this time is to have the grace with ourselves that we do not know the answer for every locale. To have grace with each other. And in the Northern Illinois Conference, I had like 2 years with them that I didn't have with you. We used the language of experimenting. I don't have 287 churches in the Northern Illinois Conference. I have 287 experiments. And I've asked them to experiment with who are the people that God has given you to love? And what are the conversations that you need to have? And what does your church offer or do? When Reverend Carlson had Kay Cotan here to train the people who are in the MCCI ministry, I asked her to come to our cabinet. And I'm a big Euripides person. Give me a lever long enough and I can move the world. Like, what's the lever that I got to do? Like, what's the one thing? If there's a one thing that I could go around when I teach and preach, what's the one thing? And she said, it's the one thing that's always been that leads to transformation, is make relationships with people and live with them. And when you have a cookout, invite your neighbor. And when they say to you in the frozen peas, my wife is stage 4, pray with them. When they say, well, you know what, I'm having a hard time. I used to be off the wagon and now I'm drinking again and I need, well, how can I walk with you? Can you want to call me or can we get to AA or can we find? Only a suffering God can help. So I don't know where in your community you're called to suffer with somebody. But we will be driven from our buildings by the cost of property insurance. And it may be, friends, that we're freed. That we're freed. I'm going to close with a story or two because I can't help myself. So there's a guy in the Northern Illinois Conference who sat next to me at some kind of training. We were learning about Peter in the New Testament. And he said to me, I got to tell you this thing. I was the board of trustee chair at this little bitty church. And I was the person that tried to make the penny stretch, you know. There would be a leak by the window, and I'd try to figure that out. And nobody wanted to be on the trustees because everything was breaking down. We were down to 17 people, and I needed to fix the toilets, and then we didn't have toilets. And then I had to figure out, the air conditioning's out. How many of you are in this building right now who are that person? Yeah, I know it. He's like, I walked into that building, and all I could see was what needed to be fixed and what I didn't have money for. Then one day I said, enough. We can't keep it all going. There's a Methodist church down the road. Let's merge with them. They sold that building. They put it into that building that they do together. And you know what he said to me? He said, now I walk in the building and I think, what class can I take? Where can I serve? What can I do? How can I get filled up in worship? What's next for me? He said, I'm free of the building. So wherever you go, tell people that there's good news on the other side of buildings. I love buildings, don't get me wrong. They keep the rain away. But the buildings are not the gospel, my last story. So the key to this is love. The key to the Methodist movement is love. So Julie and I went to Waukesha first, kind of a surprise thing on Christmas Eve. We just thought maybe our grandbaby would be there, and sure enough, our grandbaby would be there. We were there for the Lord, don't get me wrong, but we had this chance to see our grandbaby, right? So I walk in, and there's a guy who's jostling his baby, right? When I was there, that guy was the teenager in the pew that looked at me like, every week he was like. So I walk in this time and he says to me, you know, Dan, there was one sermon that you gave. And you said about my family, I knew it was about my family. You can love completely without complete understanding. You can love completely without complete understanding. I didn't come up with that. Norman McLean in A River Runs Through It came up with it. It's an old movie. It came before talk-over movies. A River Runs Through It has a story about a pastor who loses a son who he never could reach. And after his death, he stands up in his sermon that day, is 1 Corinthians 13. You can love completely without complete understanding. And he said, I don't understand my family, and I never did. But I'm trying to love them completely without complete understanding. I think that's what gets us through this hump in history. We have to be the people who love completely without complete understanding. Thanks be to God. Amen.